what you can perceive physically, okay, it's just temporary. It's just a situation. And this is why, listen, verse 3. Verse 3, I mean, when he goes from being a person, play at home being a person, and not simply a place, and then also giving us that sense of belonging or responsibility of dominion and finding the purpose of life. Look at verse 3. You turn men back to dust, saying, return to dust, O sons of man. And he goes on into verse 4 and says, for 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. So here's the thing. Verse 3 and verse 4 reminds us, if man goes back to dust, and God has said in the book of Deuteronomy, return to dust, sons of man, you got to remember that this is the experience where we have to understand, and this is what we have to, again, bring into picture, that the God that you are trusting for in 2014 is a God that operates differently. So just think for a second with me, because here's where we have to kind of understand this. As painful as it is, and some of our families have gone through the experience of losing loved ones in 2013, the separation, as you read on verse 3, the separation of the body from the soul, the separation of what I call temporary separation, is a reminder. It's a reminder that this is one of the main evidences that we were created to have dominion. Because this temporary separation reminds us that our souls live forever. That our bodies may deteriorate, may go down, and eventually go back to dust. But our souls, they live forever. So here's the challenge, and this is why I'm bringing this up to you this morning. The invitation this morning is for you and I to make decisions for 2014, not as bodies with souls. Not thinking and assuming that this is it, that everything that I see, everything that I hear is basically it. I have to pull back and understand that my soul craves, my soul desires truth. And many times when you treat your body, your life, as a body with a soul, instead of a soul with a body, you ended up embracing falsehood. So think for a second, because again, this is where we have to understand this. Can you go to the next slide, please? The evidence of our eternal destination, meaning that home is not just a place, but a person, is basically shown, presented through the momentary separation, which is your body. And again, I don't know how you have dealt with loss. I don't know how you have dealt with those temporary deals. You know, I'm 41 years old now, and I always kind of make this comment, and I reemphasize this because some of you have gone through things that I can only imagine how devastating they have been. And what if I told you? Because at age 41, I don't think I've known suffering yet. I've gone through some situations, which, by the way, let's just make a quick commercial on suffering. The issue of suffering, let me just be very straightforward with you on this issue. For the most part, I'm speaking personally. I'm not going to speak on your behalf, but and especially I'm going to speak on behalf of these folks that Moses is writing to, and the folks that he's walking with through the wilderness. It seems to me that when it comes to the issue of suffering is typically, I'm not going to as far as to say 80% of suffering is basically self-inflicted. And when I say self-inflicted, this is what I mean by that. The moment that you do life thinking that you're a body with a soul, instead of a soul with a body, is the moment that you're going to make decisions thinking that there is no eternal consequences, that you can be above the law, that you are the exception to the rule, that Jesus is only good to save you, but he's not really good enough to lord over you, to be your master, your CEO. So here's what I'm trying to imply to you, because right now, 2013 was a year that was very challenging for some of us. And again, talking about this issue of going back to dust, separating this concept of eternal existence, that we were created to be eternal, but yet we experience the pain of suffering, the pain of seeing loved ones. 2014 is going to be no exception. I know we're going to do some funerals in 2014. I hope it is not none of you. Your funeral, but some of you are gonna, we're gonna go through things that your soul is gonna be mourning and your life is going to shift into a different situation that you will never recover from the rest of your life. But here's what I'm going to remind you. Those temporary separations were not God's original plan. I believe that when you make home a person versus just a place, when you think about heaven as beginning on earth, because you are living in holiness, in Christ's likeness, I believe that you get the perspective. I believe that the Bible teaches that you get the understanding that the temporary separation that you may experience and the pain that you go through because of this separation is something that confirms your eternality. And here's the bottom line. To build the life that God wants us to build, you have to begin with the eternality, with the concept and understanding that God exists forever. And because He is God and He is sovereign and He is the everlasting God, you and I can rely on Him. Because here's the other thing you got to remember. There is no way you can launch into a brand new year relying on the same resources that you relied for 2013 and openly knowing that they did not work for you. So this is why Moses comes to us and he's invited us to think of this concept, because again, the concept how God literally works different from our concept. So let's go to the next slide, guys. So this is what I want you to think for a second. Verse 4. God embraces the concept of time differently from you, because we cannot think beyond time. God works beyond. This is why the Bible talks about 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone. Now, here's how I perceive the issue of time, because now I have an 11-year-old boy, and he's my last one of my kids, so something has happened that is different from my relationship with my girls. I love my girls, and my girls are special to me, but this guy, he just kind of turned my world upside down. And here's what's happening with him. One of the things that he has literally taken on is some of the things that I was very inclined at a younger age, and I guess it's just part of the kind of the DNA of our family and how we're doing life together. So one of the things that I'm teaching him, or I'm trying to provide for him, is his passion for sports. Because he loves sports, I love sports, and one of the things is that now, with all this new trend of, now he's an 11-year-old boy, okay? So there are some things that he cannot comprehend. Show me the next slide. So one of the things that I have done, or tried to understand, is to compare to him what is called the Dream Team. The basketball, when they went to the Olympics. And I'm trying to show you the difference between the original Dream Team of 1992, with the original group of people, which they're basically, I think 11 out of the 13, they're Hall of Famers, which implies they're some of the best athletes ever to walk on the face of the earth, compared to the ones that we have today. So anyway, so my son is literally mesmerized by, the talent of these folks that they have recently played in the Olympics. But then I tried to show him what used to be back in the early 90s. Now, in the early 90s, I just arrived to the States, so the transition culturally of embracing this sport was a little bit different from me, because I didn't come back from the same background, and I'm trying to show him, and only by showing it to him, he starts holding on and grasping the concept of what is described in this issue of time, because he can only see within the framework of an 11-year-old person. I believe the same thing happens for many of us. When it comes to the issue of God having 1,000 years like a watch of the night, like a day before Him, you need to understand that we only perceive time in the concept of how we think linear, how we perceive circumstances and what we have been, the experiences that we have gone through. What if I told you that maybe the God that is calling us this morning is the God who is not limited by time? And this is why the psalmist goes on and says in verse 5, look at your Bibles. You sweep men away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. He's just exemplifying this. Listen to verse 6. Though in the morning it springs up new, by evening it is dry and withered. Verse 7. We are consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your practice. So let's talk about this for a second. Look at the next slide, please. The body is fragile. Let's go to the next one, guys. The body is fragile, and this is why. This is on verse 7. Okay? The body is fragile, and the reason why it's fragile is because we were created to be eternal. So think for a second. See, why we have this temporary versus eternal separation is because we were created to be eternal. Verse 7 conveys this message. We're consumed by your anger and we're terrified by your indignation. In other words, we can only experience the presence of God, the fire of God that will separate that what is eternal, that what is temporary. And then he goes on in verse 8, you have set our iniquity before you, our secret sin in the light of your presence. Verse 9, all our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan, and the length of our days is 70 years or 80. If we have the strength, yet their span is but trouble and sorrow. For they quickly pass and we fly away. Listen to verse 11. Who knows the power of your anger? For wrath is as great as the fear that is due you. Verse 12. This is where the Bible takes a completely different turn. Teach us to number our days aright, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Teach us to number our days aright, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. So here's the implication. Let's go to the next slide, please. Here's the implication. We have to move beyond from existing now to living. And when you go from existing to living, when you experience a year that actually expresses the presence of God, you're going to have to understand that now this is the time where you have to go through the fire, through the circumstances that instead of just surviving them, now you are living. And this is why on verse 11, he comes with this conversation. Says, who knows the power of your anger? For the wrath is as great as the fear that is due you. Now, think for a second with me on this, because again, here's where we have to plug into something that is extremely important. Verse 12 invites us to say, teach us to number our days in the right way. When you talk about the issue of teaching, let's go to the next slide. When you go to the issue of teaching, the implication is that we do not know. You cannot approach the righteousness of God, the direction of God, assuming that you know. Now you're going to think about who's writing this, because this baby boy that was born in Egypt, he eventually is called the Prince of Egypt. He was born and raised in the most affluent culture, in a world power, being the man in charge, highly educated. And it seems to me that when he thought that he knew what he was doing, he ended up becoming a murderer. Once he was a murderer and he killed an Egyptian, he has to run away and ends up by shepherding and taking care of sheep in the wilderness. 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness, and at age 40, something happens. Something radical takes place in his life. In a burning bush, shows up in a way that just the angel of the Lord speaks to him, and through this conversion, he goes back into Egypt. And here's my point. When he discovers finally the task, the purpose of his existence, the purpose of his, again, living, the purpose of just being created for, this is the moment that he comes and says, teach us. So how many of you will approach 2014 with the mentality of being taught, instead of just assuming that we know? And here's the other thing. Next slide, please. Here's the other thing. Here's the thing why this is important. The Bible describes that we need to be taught by God. He says in verse 12, teach us how to actually experience, again, how to live our days correctly, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. The implication is that you're going to have to gain this. God is not going to give it to you. You're going to have to go for it. You're going to have to actually, by making, again, home a person instead of just a place, by understanding that this eternality that is being placed in your soul is what separates you from that moment where you become a human again, and then you experience the pain, the mixed emotions of seeing someone dying, and at the same time to trust God. I want to close today reading the remaining of the chapter, because I want you to listen to the words of Moses as he closes this instruction on verses 13 and following. Would you please listen and follow me on this? Relent, O Lord. How long will it be? How long will it be? Have compassion on your servants. Now, I said earlier that approximately 2.7 million people left Egypt into the promised land, on the journey to the promised land. Historians made a calculation that if you're going to kill 2.7 million people in 40 years, you're going to have to kill approximately 15,000 people a year. So you can be done with them by the time you enter the promised land. Now think about it. If you're Moses, and you're doing 15,000 funerals a year, that's a lot of funerals to do. I want you to hear the words of Moses when he says, how long will it be? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love. How many of you know that God's love is unfailing? See, I spoke to you this last week. I talked to you about the word Hesed. And I told you that the word Yahweh, Jehovah, is the covenant noun for God. And the word Hesed, which means unconditional, unfailing love, is the covenant verb of God. So if you got the covenant noun, which is the personal name, but also you have the covenant name. Here's what I want you to know. I want you to know that the moment that you make home a person versus a place, God's faithfulness, God's, again, consistency, unfailing love is worth over your trust. But I want you to hear this. I'm not talking about Him being faithful to your agenda. He's only faithful to His own promises. Are you following this? Because this is where, see, if you don't hear this from me, you're going to think that automatically you get a green light to do as you please and God is still going to bless it. No, that's not what I'm saying. See, Moses is a perfect example. How many of you remember that Moses did not make it to the promised land? Because he had, listen, I said this before, he had to punish the sin that he committed. Not because Moses misbehaved, although Moses misbehaved. Not because Moses broke the law, although Moses broke the law. What's the reason? The reason why he needs to punish and give the consequences of our, again, trespasses. The reason why Moses did not make it is because of God's character. Because of who He is in His essence. See, 2014 has to be the year that is all about the character of God. This church must be consumed, not with just moving forward, not with just being a healthy church. Our consuming experience has to be knowing, experiencing, and expressing the character of God. Parenting is not about just training good kids to become good citizens. It's about showing them through parental skills the character of God. It's all about the essence of God. So listen to this. Have compassion on us, your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all of our days. Are you listening to the words? I just told you that 15,000 people die approximately every day, and He expects them to sing. Who sings in the midst of mourning? Who sings when you're in trouble? Come on, think for a second. You sing when you are in mourning, when you rely on the promises that God made to Himself, not to you. Because when you made home a person, that means that you embrace the promises He has made, not to you, but to Himself. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many years as we have seen trouble. May your deeds, verse 16, may your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. I'd like for you to get on your feet to read verse 17 with me as we close this morning. I want you to think of verse 17 as a prayer for you beginning this brand new year. May the favor of the Lord, our God, rest upon us. Establish the word of our hands for us. Yes, establish